Towards the end of last year, I made this dining chair, and I actually think it looks really great, but there's just a bunch of problems with it. I made some design choices which meant that the build process was really inefficient, and my main problem is this back rail. The way I've made it doesn't look very good, and the way I've designed it has left a bunch of gaps, which also looks pretty terrible, and it's not very comfortable. So all in all, not a great result. But I really want to give this chair another go. So in this video, I'm going to remake this chair, I'm going to try and fix up all the problems with it, and hopefully by the end, I'll have a chair that I'm really happy with. So in order to make a new and improved version of this chair, I'm going to go through each part and remake it and redesign it and fix up any problems that I had, and I'll talk about any of the issues that I had with this version as I'm going. I initially made a CAD model, and this isn't a super refined model, but it's just going to help me with any of the critical angles, particularly with the backrest, which I'll get to a little bit later on. But firstly, I'll get started remaking the base. So I'm going to swap out this central hub part of the seat base. And I actually don't mind the way it looks. I think it looks quite cool, but it's just an absolute pain in the ass to make. And if I was ever going to make a bunch of these chairs, making multiples of this part would just be extremely tedious and time consuming. So I'm just going to swap it out with a simple half lap. I'm also going to get rid of these parts. I don't think they're doing anything and they're super ugly. I've actually used this hub design before on a round table, and in that situation I think it worked quite nicely. It was a design feature and also a one-off, so spending a bit more time on a part didn't make a huge difference, but under a chair which will very rarely get seen, it feels a bit silly to overcomplicate a part when a nicely fitting half flap with some roundovers will probably look quite nice, and may even end up being stronger. When I was cutting my parts to width, I cut an extra scrap to help me dial in the blade height, and I gradually crept up on that middle line, and once I had a tiny amount in the middle left, I was happy to start cutting my joints. It's a little hard to see here, but I have a stop block up against the fence and I'm using the actual part as a width offset to cut the left side of the half lap. Then to cut the other side of the joint, I can put my part up against that stop block, but I've got an Allen key that's the same width as the table saw blade to offset the cut by the exact width of the table saw blade, which means I can essentially cut this part without measuring. And it leaves me with a perfect fit. My flat grind table saw blade needs to be sharpened, so I ended up using my cross-cut blade, which left a few little ridges that needed to be removed with the router plane. Turns out these parts might have been a little bit too tight once I've added the glue. I had to get the old persuasion machine out to help these two parts come together. But it turned out fine and everything was nice and square. The next part I'm going to be remaking are the legs, and because I've designed this chair in CAD, the shape of the legs have changed a little bit, so I need to remake the templates, and to help me do that I've got an exciting new tool. So this is the Creality Falcon2 Pro. It's a 40-watt laser cutter engraver, and I'm going to be road testing on this project to see whether I can sort of use it like a CNC. So I've got quite a small workshop and there's just really no space for a CNC, even though I'd really love one. I've been designing a lot of my projects in CAD recently, and I've been really wanting a way to quickly print templates and prototypes based on those CAD designs. And that's where I'm hoping a laser will come in really handy for me. Obviously it's a lot smaller than a CNC and it's quite light, so it's quite mobile, and obviously it sits quite comfortably on a shelf. And I think in some ways it's actually probably more convenient than a CNC for making templates. It's got a cutting area of a bit over 40 centimeters by 40 centimeters, which might seem a little bit small on some projects, but I do have a workaround for that, and I'll show you what I mean in my design software. Okay, so this is my design in Onshape, and I want to make a template based on this back leg and this front leg, but at the moment these parts are too big to fit on the bed of the laser cutter. So what I've done is I've taken these legs and I've divided them in half around this line. And I've done that with the front leg as well, and I'm essentially just making the world's easiest jigsaw puzzle. Then I can jump into the assembly tab and flat lay them, and then once I've done that, I can make a drawing based on that. This is a one-to-one drawing, and then I can export this as a DXF file. So obviously I've just raced through this whole process, but if this is something you're interested in, you would like me to go into a little bit more deeply, let me know, and I can do that in a different video. But for the time being, I'm going to take this file, I'm going to stick it on a thumb drive and head out to the workshop. So I've just imported this file into Lightburn, and this is what it looks like. You can move around these files individually if you like, but I'm going to leave them where they are because they're in the right spot. One of the really handy things about this Creality printer though is the fact that it's got a camera built into the frame, and I can update this overlay, and I can see here that I've put a piece of MDF in here but it's not in the right spot. So I can move that around and update the overlay, And now I can see that that MDF is in the right spot and these parts can actually print out properly. Quick sidebar, but I've been playing around with ways I could potentially use the laser to incorporate my logo into my work. And it's really handy being able to accurately place this little logo in the right spot and use up some scrap wood while I'm getting this process right. So one option is to cut a little medallion like this and then route a recess and then fit it under a table or something, which I think would look quite cool. I could also use a piece of solid wood and engrave my logo directly onto a part if it was small enough to fit into this machine. I didn't actually end up doing either of these things on this chair, but it's definitely an option for down the track. Anyway, back to the build. I'm cutting these parts out of 6mm MDF, and to get an idea of time frame, this took about 4 minutes to cut these templates out. There are a bunch of tests you can do to optimize cut quality by adjusting the speed and the power of the cut, or you can just look up what other people's settings are. But one thing I had to adjust was the kerf offset. So anytime you're making a cut, it's going to remove a bit of material, whether that's with a saw blade or with a laser. And I made some little test parts to sort of dial in this fit, and initially this was quite loose. But in Lightburn, what you can do is you can offset the kerf so it cuts slightly outside of that line. And after a bit of trial and error, I have a really nice tight fit. I was really impressed with how accurately these parts cut out. And with a bit of CA glue and some activator very inaccurately sprayed, this part was as good as being solid. And this is proof how flat this part actually came out. The next step is to mark out these parts onto this Tasmanian blackwood. Tassie blackwood's a great chair making timber. It's reasonably light but still pretty strong. It's got plenty of quirks though. The colour can vary pretty dramatically between boards, so colour matching can be a bit difficult. And I think I must have a bit of an allergy to the wood dust. I do wear a dust mask pretty much the entire time I'm in the workshop, but I still often end up with a bit of an irritated throat and nose after a full day of working with this stuff. Despite all of this, it's a really great timber to work with and it machines really nicely. At this stage, I've now got all the legs roughed out at the bandsaw. Because the front legs have a flat reference surface, I can cut the angle at the base of the legs with the miter gauge. Once I've cut the bottom angle, I can use my template up against the stop block on the fence side. And after adjusting the angle of the miter gauge, I can cut this part to length. In Onshape, I quickly sketched up this part to hold the front legs in the right place whilst I cut the correct angle on the mating face. I then laser cut them out and brad nailed them to a piece of scrap ply. After using my template to make sure this sled was in the right spot, I could cut this part out. I then double-sided taped my template to this part and finished shaping it at the router table. I recently upgraded to a compression template bit. I use template bits on pretty much every project, and this router bit is just so much better than anything I've ever used. They're definitely not cheap, but they really make life at the router table much less stressful, and I highly recommend getting one if you're on the fence. For the back legs, the process was reversed and I had to do all the shaping at the router table first. Now that I had a flat reference surface on these legs, I could cut the base angle. I left the top long as that was going to get trimmed later on. I then made another makeshift sled with a laser cut workpiece holder to cut this mating face. This cut might look a little bit sketchy from this angle, but my fingers are actually quite a way away from the blade and it's actually pretty safe. Similar to the first chair, I'll be using dominoes to attach the legs to the base. After cutting in some dominoes, I had to do a little test fit just to see how everything was looking. I then rounded over all these pieces. I'm not sure why I didn't get any more footage, but they got completely rounded over, so they looked round. And I'm using epoxy to glue all this together. I don't want any flex in these joints, and this epoxy dries incredibly hard. And like most epoxy, this is pretty messy stuff and not super pleasant to work with. And here I'm putting everything together with some absolutely Oscar-worthy camera angles. Using dominoes allows for a tiny bit of wiggle room, which just means that I can adjust these parts to be perfectly flush. The next step is to make the seat base, and this process is more or less the same as it was for the first version. So over the last couple of years, I've been able to turn my woodworking hobby into something that makes a modest amount of money, and I'm incredibly appreciative of the situation I'm in and the workshop space I've been lucky enough to build up. In saying that, if I was to take my business a little bit more seriously, I'd probably be focusing more on tables and beds, or things that are just a bit more profitable, and not just keep making chairs, which is something I keep coming back to time and time again. But I just don't enjoy building anything else quite as much as chairs. There's just something about the challenge that tickles my brain, even when I've got to make the same chair 3 or 4 times before I land on something I'm happy with. I've literally spent months thinking about remaking this chair in the lead up, and at no point during the build did I get bored or feel like I just wanted the project to end, which inevitably happens at some point on a non-chair build. Making this seat base blank is about as straightforward and mundane a task as there was on this project, but even this seemed more interesting to me for some reason. Right, so whilst that part's drying, I've just cut out this template at the laser to cut the seat to its final shape. And making this part accurately for the first iteration was pretty time consuming, but cutting out in the laser took maybe 5 minutes to export the file, bring it down to the laptop, let the laser do its thing. So a massive time saver. I also really want to thank Creality for sending me this machine to try out in this project. They didn't ask for a review, they just wanted me to integrate it into a project and see if I liked it. And I was a little bit skeptical about how useful I'd find it, but after extensively using it on this project, I can pretty categorically say that this is an extremely useful and worthy addition to any woodworking shop. After this blank had dried, I could trace on the shape of the seat base and then head over to the bandsaw to roughly cut it out. I mentioned at the start of this video that I think a laser is a more convenient option for cutting templates than a CNC. And I say that from a place of never having actually used a CNC, but there is just so little resistance to printing at the laser. It takes next to no time to export a file from the computer, then plug it into the cutter, punch in some settings and hit print, and then 2 minutes later you have a perfect template. The cover on it serves a dual purpose as well. It means you can look at it cutting without going blind, and it also catches all of the smoke, which is then fed out the back via an inline fan, and you can then duct it with the included flex pipe outside. So in theory, you could very easily set this up in a bedroom or an office as long as you're near a window. I'm sure cutting a shape like this would be pretty easy on a CNC, but the speed, the lack of noise, and the lack of mess is just very compelling with a laser cutter. The only time I think a CNC would trump a laser on this project is carving the seat dish, which a laser obviously can't do, but a CNC could. I drew on a guideline, again with a piece that I laser cut, and then roughly sketched the outline of where I want the dishing to extend to around the edge of the seat. I then used my track saw to cut some depth guidelines, and this will help me in the next step to power carve to the correct depth. I took the seat base outside for this next step, which is extremely messy and pretty loud. Sorry, neighbours. But it's also really fun. I'm always drawn to these parts of projects where there's a bit of carving or a bit of freehand, and I get to sort of feel my way through the process. I'm using a Kutzall Extreme shaping dish on my angle grinder, and it actually gives quite a lot of control. It's not grabby at all, and it doesn't feel like you're doing something overly sketchy. It takes off quite a bit of material though, and it definitely makes a massive mess. The Kutzall doesn't leave a terrible surface, but there's definitely still a reasonable amount of sanding required to clean up the cut marks. After adding a small round over to the top, the seat base was done and onto the seat back. So the seat back has the biggest amount of design changes from the first version to this one that I'm making. On the first version, I did a bit of a strange lamination and then template routed the shape. And admittedly, I did this because it was the quickest way of getting that shape happening, but it doesn't look that nice seeing the laminations sort of crossing over each other. The most ideal thing would be to steam bend a solid piece, but I don't really trust my abilities to do that, and I'm also using kiln dried wood, which is much harder to bend than air dried wood. So the next best option is a bent lamination. Again, I laser cut out a set of templates, one for the inside radius and one for the outside, and I'm stacking up layers of MDF here to make 2 molds. I'm doing 2 layers of MDF at once, then template routing, then adding 2 more layers, just so I'm not having to take too much off on each pass. It's really nasty stuff and the dust is awful, but it definitely machines nicely. Then I added 1 more layer of MDF just for good measure. I did a test bend with this black wood and I was comfortably able to bend about 10mm thick strips, which was handy because I needed to make this seat back with as few laminations as possible. The wood I'm starting out with is about 38mm thick and the final thickness of the seat back needs to be 30mm. Each cut at the bandsaw and shallow pass at the jointer to remove the bandsaw marks was taking off about 1.5 millimeters, so any more than 3 cuts on this piece and it would have meant that it would have come out too thin. I also needed to allow enough thickness to remove the bandsaw marks from the opposite side of these boards. Next up, it was time to steam these parts, and I always find this process pretty remarkable, being able to add heat and turn wood into something flexible. After about 20 minutes in the steam box, I took these strips out and put them into the mould, and this was a little bit more difficult than I'd anticipated, but it all came together in the end. After about half an hour, or until they were cool to the touch, I took these strips out of the mould and set them aside to dry for about 24 hours. This allowed me some time to turn my attention back to the seat base and deal with one of the more tedious jobs of cleaning up the transitions. I started off with a half-round rasp, then tried out one of these drill-powered spindle sander attachments. This one was pretty cheap and not that great quality, but it did a pretty good job. I also bought a slightly more expensive one that's much better quality, but the radius was too big and I could only use it on the undersides. Back onto the seat back, and after work one night I got onto gluing the strips up. Regular PVA doesn't dry super stiffly, so it does allow for a bit of spring back once it's taken out of the clamps, but for this design a bit of spring back isn't actually an issue. I could have used a polyurethane glue to avoid this, but I just prefer not having to deal with the mess. I used some squeeze clamps to close the mould most of the way, then I brought in the pipe clamps to add the real clamping pressure. The next day it was nice and dry and I could take it back out of the clamps. I cleaned up one face at the jointer and then I started to clean up the other face at the table saw. But pretty quickly this cut started to feel a bit dodgy, so I kneed the off switch and bailed out on this cut. I then finished off cleaning up this face at the jointer, which I felt much more comfortable doing. And it doesn't really matter if these two faces aren't perfectly parallel. Before I could attach this seat back to the legs, I needed to cut the back legs to their final length, and I also wanted this cut to be at 7 degrees. I figured that this step would be easiest once the seat has been fully assembled, so I made this makeshift sled to help me make that cut. I'm adding this thin strip so that the top of the legs have something to slightly raise them up. If I didn't do this, I was a little bit worried that once that first leg got cut that the chair would rock a little bit, given that I've just chopped off the part that was holding it up. And then I just used some hot glue to hold it down. After zeroing out my bevel gauge, I could then angle the blade over at 7 degrees relative to that seat base. The reason behind the 7-degree angle is to try and improve the comfort of this seat back, but I'll get into that a little bit more later. The original way that I attached the seat back to the base was via a notch that I'd cut in the back legs. I essentially figured out how to cut this based on some rough measurements, which ended up leaving some nasty gaps. Trying to improve on this step gave me the most trouble, as firstly I couldn't really figure out how to model this part very well, and then once I'd figured that out, I realised that the notch would have to be a really complicated compound angle, and then even if I figured out how to really accurately cut this notch, there would still be a small radius from the seat back that I just wasn't sure how to deal with. Ultimately, I gave up on this method and decided I'd attach the seat back directly to the top of the legs with some dowels. After figuring out the right place for this seat back to sit, I'm marking out where the legs will attach so that I can add a bit of shape to it. I actually ended up being really happy with this design change. Similar to the scoop on the seat base, I really enjoyed the shaping process of this seat back. Down the track, I might try and figure out a way of making this process a bit more precise, but there was just a lot of feel and vibes about what looked good, which is such a nice change sometimes from everything needing to be perfect. So here I'm just roughing out these parts at the bandsaw and I'll finish shaping once it's attached to the legs. As I mentioned earlier, this seat back will be sitting at 7 degrees, and that was as much of a tilt as I was willing to add. Any more than that and it sort of looked like the wings of the seat back were pointing to the sky, which I didn't think looked that good. But after sitting at some similar but much more comfortable seats, I found the ideal angle for a lower back support is more like 15 degrees, so I figured I could just cut the remaining 8 degrees from the face of this part. I tilted my table over to 8 degrees and made the cut, but my bandsaw blade was quite dull and I didn't have a sharp replacement, so this cut wasn't quite as successful as I was hoping, which meant that I had to do quite a lot of spoke shaving. I quite like spoke shaving though. I think it might be one of my favourite tools, but one downside of this particular process is I've got a flat-soled spoke shave, and shaping this curved part meant that I had to extend the blade a bit more than I would like, and that resulted in a bit of a ratty finish. But after a good sand, this ended up working out pretty well. The humble dowel is the joinery method of choice for this part. I don't have to be super precise about the hole placement, and I'm actually planning on making these holes a little bit sloppy to allow for plenty of epoxy to flood into the joint. I find that a tightly fitting dowel doesn't let all that much glue into the hole, and I trust the strength of epoxy more than I trust the strength of a dowel. I'm using these little dowel guide pins to transfer the hole placement from the legs to the seat rest. Before I start mixing up some epoxy, I gave this part a little test fit and it's all looking pretty tickety-boo. After about 24 hours, the epoxy had dried and it was time to finish up the shaping of the backrest, and this process was easily my favourite part of the whole build. My work generally involves quite a lot of these small transitions, and I decided to pick up a Dremel with a carbide carving bit to try and speed up this process. It did take a little bit of getting used to, but once I got into the swing of things, carving these transitions was really enjoyable. I might try some sort of whittling knife in the future for this part, but for the time being, this Dremel did a really good job. I decided to add a bit of a round over to the back underside of this seat rest, which would have been a lot easier to do before I glued the seat back on, but I didn't really know the exact shape or look I was after until I could get a look at the chair as a whole. This is definitely not an overly efficient process, and it took quite a while, but I really enjoyed it, so I didn't mind taking my time. I was nearing the finish line, and one of the last processes was the attachment method for the seat top to the base. I'm going to use bolts and threaded inserts, and I really wish I drilled these holes before I glued this all up, as this would have been a lot better to do at the drill press. I'm freehanding this 15mm countersink for the bolt to recess in, which thankfully came out relatively straight. And then I'm following up with an 8mm hole with a regular bit that goes all the way through. On the laser, I cut a small 3mm spacer shim to help me position the seat top in the perfect position. Then I clamped it in place, and then with an 8mm brad point bit, I could mark the hole position through the base into the seat. Next, I could drill the holes for the threaded inserts to go into. I'm drilling a nice big countersink here, and this just helps to recess the threaded insert. I used a bit of candle wax to help put these threaded inserts in, and this actually helped quite a lot. It was time for a final sand before I could put finish on, and I spent a really long time making 100% sure to get rid of any pigtail swirls or scratch marks from previous grits. I saw this trick on Instagram of putting a Scotch-Brite pad on the sander in between grits, which is a really neat way of cleaning the dust out of the pores without having to blast it out with compressed air and just filling the workshop with that fine dust. After a final hand sand of the base, just making sure I haven't missed anything, I can finally get on with the oiling. The first coat gets put on quite liberally, then after about 20 minutes or until it sort of gets a bit sticky, I then wipe it off. After about a day, I then come back and add a second coat, then a third coat after that, each time adding just slightly less oil. The final step is buffing in a beeswax polish with some steel wool. This burnishes out any issues with the oil finish stage and just leaves a beautiful silky feel to the touch. This then also gets wiped off with a microfiber cloth. I was finally able to attach the seat base to the seat top, and I was really happy with how this is all coming together. I'm usually pretty happy with each project as I finish it, but I'm particularly proud of this one. I just put so much care and effort into it, and I think it really shows. Obviously nothing's ever perfect, but I really tried with this build to get as close as I possibly could. I had a tiny amount of rock to the seat, so I clamped some sandpaper to my workbench and just sanded a very small amount off the longer legs, which sorted this problem out. And with that, the chair was done.